tools of the wood boat building industry. Some of them you'll recognize right away, and some you probably won't. They're not all from Robinson's. I collect tools. A lot of these were my dad's when he worked at Robinson's as a shipbuilder. But if you get a chance after the presentation, come on up, take a look, pick them up. They're yours to touch, and I'll answer any questions you have about it.
You're all set.
Okay, thank you. If you have a question during this presentation, I do not mind being interrupted. Just shout out or raise your hand, and I'll try to answer your question as best I can. Robinson's was formed by Glenn Robinson. At the time that he formed Robinson Marine Construction Company, he was a treasurer for Diesel Carter. There were three major boat builders in the Twin Cities area: Truscott Boat, Diesel Carter, and Robinson's. Robinson's barely outlasted them all. Truscott closed first, then Diesel Carter, and then Robinson's. Two things did in the boat building business, out of wood anyway. Fiberglass, of course, came in the 50s, and I still prefer a wood boat over fiberglass any day, but it did change the industry, and people's desires and how they wanted to spend their money also affected it. He was a treasurer for Diesel Carter. Robinson started his business in 1925. Now you're going to find 24 or 26, depending on what source you use. I believe it was 25. And another inconsistency is when it actually shut down. Now the employees building boats were long gone by 1960. And we'll talk about the last boat that was launched from Robinson Marine later on. Imagine starting out a business in 1925 and 4 years later this happens. The Great Depression. 29 to 39, and yet Mr. Robinson made it a success. He was known to be a dynamic, and the word dynamic is true here, salesman. He was a very consummate salesman, and he had a lot of connections all over the country, especially with the military. He was a naval flyer during World War I, when they were first putting together the Army Air Corps and the Navy Air Corps. And he had a lot of connections in New Orleans and in Washington, and he'd make many trips. My dad used to take him to the airport to make trips to Washington and New Orleans. We don't have any pictures of Robinson's house, but this painting, they were the last house on Ridgeway heading south just before the yacht club. It was an English two-door home, beautiful. There was a tall hedge in front of everything. You couldn't see this from Ridgeway, but it was a beautiful home. And we're honored to have Mike and Ann McCausland here tonight, and is Glenn Robinson's granddaughter. And I have a picture of her a little later on that she may not want me to show her, but this was their home. I've been there many times. It was a beautiful home. And it was right on the west side of Ridgeway, and it went right back to the lake. It was just a beautiful piece of property. Robinson decided to use the seagull as his moniker. So it was the seagull, and that is a step plate that is always on the side of the boat. When you enter the boat, you step onto the step plate. And that was Robinson's moniker, was the seagull. So all of his boats were called Seagull Series. And he published in a lot of the yachting and boating magazines. Now this you can tell is probably from the 20s, the shape of the boat and some of the language. He had a lot of ads running in those magazines. Here's one. We'll talk more about this one. One of the boats that he built had a charter commuter business from Benton Harbor to Chicago. Round trip. It took 2 hours one way, 2 hours back. Now, it's about 65 miles from here to Chicago by water. And that boat had to be moving pretty well. 39 to 45 feet was a typical size boat that Robinson's built. What impressed me was that boat could be 45 miles an hour. How many 50-foot boats did you know do 45 miles an hour? And this is back in the 20s and 30s. It was impressive. That's a wow. Here's some more ads. Here's an article from Boating Magazine in 1935 mentioning the Robinson Seagull boat Phantom 8 making a daily commuter run from Chicago to Benton Harbor, 60 miles one way in under 2 hours, and it used 2 Kermath engines. I got a lot of questions from people on Facebook wanting to know what engines were used in Robinson's boats, and we have a whole section on that today, so hopefully you'll get your questions answered. That boat was 32 feet in length, 10-foot beam, and 32-inch draft. This is another one, I'm sorry. This is a Seagull Invader. Look at the prices, $33.90 to $4,090. You say, well, that's not too bad. Well, wait a minute. $1 in 1935 equals $21.66 in 2023. So $40.90 in 1935 is $88,588 today. So these were not cheap boats. And that's one of the things that kind of gave Glenn Robinson an advantage, because his clientele often were not affected with huge changes in the economic situation. People always wanted nice things. Where was Robinson's located? There were 2 locations. The early one was at 627 West Main Street in Benton Harbor, kind of right down the street from here. The later one was located on what I called Industrial Island, which is now Marina Island. This is a picture taken, I believe, in the 60s. You may not recognize this, but this was the original Sears building built right next to the river. That was my Sears. There's the shipping canal that's still there today. Of course, north Benton Harbor and south is Main Street, heading. The bridge is coming up right after you cross the bridge. There was Robinson's building in 1925. And as Chuck said earlier, that building is owned by Richard Revers, and he has lovingly restored it. And here is a view today of what used to be Sears. There's the new bridge, there's the marina, and there is the building right there. So that was where Glenn started his business in 1925. Richard, I'd like you to come up and maybe share a couple things with us on the slides that you see, or shout out or whatever. He just lovingly restored it recently. This is the front view of it from maps taken, I think, last year or the year before. And this is what it looked like after Glenn Robinson left. Richard, can you share anything with us?
Sure. A gentleman named Vern Shaw came by knocking on the door one day. It didn't look like this. I'd owned the building for a few years, but it was presentable. And he wanted to share this photo and a few others that may follow this one. There you go. His father took over he didn't buy Robinson Marine, but he bought the building, I assume, and created his own sort of a combination boat and auto business. And this, going back there, this is when Robinson's occupied the building. That boat, interestingly, is not listed as a product of Robinson Marine in some of the documentation that I found, but it obviously exists. It's a Seagull, and it was shipped to Miami.
We'll get into a little bit more detail on how these boats were built, but the inside of the old Robinson's building was very confining for space, and they soon outgrew it. These are some shots, and I'm sorry for the quality of the pictures. These were black and white pictures taken in And I've done all I can to use Photoshop and all their ideas to get them as clean as possible. You can tell by this, what I call squared off cabins and anything. That's an early 20s, 20 to maybe mid-30s boat. They changed the design, they streamlined it a little more after that. So this is taken probably late 20s, early 30s. And there's a picture of one of the engines. Now guys, if you take a look at that, maybe you'll notice that there's 2 spark plugs per cylinder. And that was supposed to be brand new technology back in the 70s and 80s. Not so. They had it back in the 20s. This is the back of Richard's building. And this door right here was open, and you could actually drive a boat right into that door. And that's how they launched those boats back then. They had slings and ramps and so on that you could get that boat right in there. And that's still there today. I think you kept the ramp in there, right?
There's no incline rail anymore.
It's all slings.
I'm not launching boats.
Right, okay.
You use it to store boats? You
Yeah.
keep a floating boat in there?
Yes.
You have a lift for it or not?
There's no, well, I do have a small crane, but just for runabout dinghy kind of thing.
And again, that backs up to the shipping canal and is still there today. Now, on that same shipping canal was Rachel Carter's boat business. Now, Richard tells me that some of the Rachel Carter buildings are still standing today and used by other companies, but I didn't know that. Rachel Carter was a bigger company than Robinson's. During the war, they employed up to 750 people. Robinson was about 350 during the war. Rachel Carter built bigger boats than Robinson's did. The largest boat Robinson ever built was 110 foot. Rachel Carter built minesweepers. That was one of their main fortes. Rachel Carter always side launched boats of big sizes. They put them on a skid and tipped them sideways, and they fell into the shipping canal. This is a picture that Shirley Abrams gave me. This is her mother launching a military boat from Rachel Carter. And I wanted to include that in the presentation. It had nothing to do with Robinson's, but launching a boat back in those days was a big deal. Shirley James Abrams' mother christening the craft, which is a PC-665, which is not a minesweeper, I believe it's an aircraft rescue boat. Now we'll move to the new Robinsons, and that was once called Industrial Island, now called Marina Island. Just to give you a reference, this is from maps again. Here's the Blossom Land Bridge. There's St. Joe, there's the shipping canal and Benton Harbor, and there's the island. Now when I was a kid, there were big oil tanks on the east side of Industrial Island. There's a oil storage facility there. Now they're all gone now. Here is where Robinson's was. Actually, some of the buildings were there, but they built a lot of new buildings. This is what it looked like when Glenn first moved into the business. This big building was the main operation, but where this yellow arrow is were all new buildings built shortly after they moved in. We'll show you pictures of those. What year they actually moved, we haven't been able to pinpoint the year. Somewhere, we think, in the early 30s. Because they were in business in 36, I know that. This is an overhead view. Chuck, can we kill some of these lights maybe that might give us a little more detail on the slides? There we go, much better.
Thank you.
Thank you. There, now we can see. This is an overhead view, obviously taken by the flyer at the time. Here is the old bridge that I remember. This is the Theodore Roosevelt, which was dropped passengers and picked passengers up on that long dock building. That was the Lake Freighters building for a long, long, long time, and was there even afterwards. And the USS Har, which was the U.S. Navy Reserve training ship, was tied up there for years. I remember, I went on board that a couple times. Maybe you can remember the Har being there during your time. This is the old bridge. And interestingly enough, this was a refinery dock also. And I don't know how much you know about freighters, but there's a design that's pretty much obsolete now called a whaleback. And there was a whaleback oil ship that docked right here. It was called the Meteor. And if you look up some history, you'll find some very interesting stories about whaleback ships.
I have a question.
Yes.
Back in like early 60s, I remember them talking about potato boats in the wintertime. Do you know anything about that?
Well, they stored potatoes in some of the lake freighters and in that dock.
I knew it was in that area.
Yeah, that was a so-called a great environment for potato storage. There was also a nice roller rink in there.
Right.
I know a lot of you are nodding your heads because you went roller skating in there. And right behind that was a bigger building called Michigan Electric. They had a huge business there. So let's take a look at this. This is a side launch area. This building right here is Schultz Roofing. They've been there a long time. But there was one of the build areas, and the side launch, they just skid it off this way and go into the water. This is the fitting out dock, and you're going to see some of the military boats tied up to that dock. And this building right here, you'll see in a moment, was the supply room for all of the ancillary things that you put on the boat after it's built. There's the office building that Glenn built. That was not there when they moved in. That was a Wake two-story office building. I've had the honor of sitting in Glenn's desk and using some of his stationery. I can remember as a kid drawing pictures. Dad got kind of mad at me. And this is the supply room and the welding shop. Now you're looking at the bridge, and of course out here is the lake, and the river comes in back here. And on the other side of the island, of course, where Mulhagen's fishery were and so on. This building was the assembly and storage building for some of the subunits and smaller boats that later became Rush Power Docks Marina, which we'll talk about later on. There was one of the larger buildings that was sub-assembly, and that was connected in two places, there and there, to this big building. And you'll see many views of that inside. What's going on here? That's what's going on. There was a railroad access to Industrial Island. And it curved around, and I have one picture that I found of the railroad across the river into Benton Harbor, about where Kmart used to be.
Yeah.
There was a railroad crossing of the river with pylons, every so often. And Glenn shipped a lot of boats out by rail, and of course he got a lot of supplies, wood and other things, engines, by rail. So these buildings here were assembly and wood storage. There is the boiler room and steam generator. Now, those of you familiar with building boats know that it was very common back to bend wood using steam. So several places in the yard there were steam boxes that were supplied from this boiler. So you heat wood up real hot, and then you can bend it like a pretzel and it won't break. That was one of the things that Robinson did a lot of. There is the marine railway that was not there when Glenn bought the building, or this property. He installed that later on. That is a railway that is connected with tracks, and then when you launch a boat on the railway, they have a winch that just lets this thing go back into the water, and it falls away from the cradle and is on its own. It was the only marine railway in Benton Harbor. There's the Theodore Roosevelt, very common later on passenger ship. City of Benton Harbor, City of Grand Rapids, all made trips to Benton Harbor. Of course, it was big for the House of David. They brought a lot of passengers in with passenger boats. And this is where most of the larger boats were built. And they were built outside without any covering other than canvas. And they were built year-round. So in the middle of winter, they were out there building these boats, especially during the war. This is the main building where most of the assembly of the boat took place. And I have pictures later on of that. This canal is in this picture, but it was later filled in so that the marine railway turntable could be put in this area. They used to launch boats right there before they had the railway using a boom crane, and we'll show you a picture of that. This was the wood machine shop. This was another side launch area for some of the smaller boats because the river right here is quite shallow. This, you see these growth right here, weeds and everything, and they could never get this deep enough to do anything more. That's why they had this area here, and they put the marine railway in, because this is not a very deep spot. And depending on the seasons you have with a lot of silt in the river, it got shallower. And there is, I want to talk about this. This is the shallow part of the river, so Glenn, and with approval of the city of Benton Harbor and St. Joe, bought a 110-foot hull. It was actually the hull. Everything else had been taken off the boat. It was wooden, and they sunk it right there. The boat's name was Tannis, T-A-N-N-I-S, of Duluth. I don't know if any of you were on the yard or remember that boat, but the stern was sticking here on the shore, and it tapered down into the water, and their thinking was it would divert the river around that and eliminate that shallow area right there. It didn't work too well, but they did try it. The river has a mind of its own. This is another view in the opposite perspective, looking up the river. There's the same weeds we talked about just now. There's again outside work area. A lot of work was done outside. Again, the wood machine shop. Again, the main framing and layout loft. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Remember the word loft. Again, the railway. My dad was one of the operators of the railway. There's a little building right there, you can't see it, but all of the machinery for the railway was in that building. Again, the outdoor framing area for the large military boats that were built. Again, the main storeroom and gas welding assembly. The office building. There's Schultz Roofing. They always had their name on the roof. Any of you remember that? In my era, it was the Jungle Inn. It was changed later on to the Anchor Inn. But I remember it as the Jungle Inn, and I had many a hamburger in there with my dad. I have no idea if it's still there or not. It probably isn't. How many of you have been to the Anchor Inn or the Jungle Inn? Okay, we know what we're talking about. Because Robinson's built military craft, the security was very tight, and they had a guard shack with a gate that you had to pass through, and they had a 24/7 guard in that shack. Now, many of you who have been in factories know what brass in and brass out means. You're given a brass tab with your name and number on it, and you have to give that to the guard, and he puts it on a rack. And you come back out and you get your brass back. So they know you're in there and they know you left. Again, the additional assembly building. More secondary, where the cabinets were built in that secondary building there. I can remember stacks and stacks and stacks of 3/4 inch mahogany plywood. Just solid mahogany, by the way. Plywood, all layers were mahogany. Just phenomenal. Outside and indoor lumber storage. I would love to have you take a look at this piece of wood up here after the presentation. It's about a 4x6, but it's extremely rare. And there's a note that I put on there I'd like you to read. This wood came in rail cars. Each piece was 25 feet long without joints. And it was I found a place in Spokane, Washington, where you can buy it, but you better take a mortgage out on your house. The railway access was right there, made a big circle, and then crossed back into Benton Harbor. This canal system again was filled in, so a railway was built with a turntable right here that boats, full size, ready to go, were backed out of this building right there onto the railway and then turned and then back over to the launch railway. And that's what it looked like. This is before it was put in. This is what Robinson looks like today. The owners of the marina sent me those pictures, graciously enough. And the white lines basically are where Robinson's was. Now this bridge is all new, but that's kind of where Robinson's was back then. There's another view looking southwest. Again, Robinson's was right about in that area. Boats. All boats, especially wooden boats back then, were built with a system called lofting. Some of you guys are nodding your head like you know what that is. Robinson's had a huge layout loft on the second floor of that big building. I don't have any pictures of it, I wish I did. I remember going up there as a kid, and they literally had drafting paper 20 feet long because they didn't have CAD machines back then. All drawings were made full size. They had a bevy of draftsmen working there. So what is lofting? Lofting is draftsmen making a 3-view drawing of a boat. Top, in, and profile. From those blueprints, full size, they make patterns. Scaled patterns usually. And that's a picture. This is not Robinson. This is just a picture of them using blueprints to make patterns. There's a Robinson's pattern. They're making patterns so that when they build the boat, everything will be the same, according to the print. They made a full-size pattern of the keel. The keel is the very first piece of wood that is put down when you build a wooden boat. And there's a pattern for a keel. There's an actual, another pattern of the keel. You can see the blueprints right there. Now there's a tool down here that I'll show you. It's called a pantograph. And the pantograph, they would trace that pattern with a pantograph and it would blow up that drawing to whatever size you needed. No copy machines, plus, no. They did it by hand. And here's some more pattern making, just to give you an idea. Now there is a set of rib patterns set up on a mock-up bench, ready to be given to the machine shop to make some ribs. This picture was taken in 1600, not a picture, it was a drawing. 1600. They built ships exactly the same way in 1600 that they did in the 30s. This is a British man of war, 185 feet long, 51 feet wide, built in the 1700s. It's there today. The HMS Victory. It was built exactly using the same method Glenn Robinson did. So here we are back at Robinson's. There's the Theodore Roosevelt. And the first thing they've done, the first step in building a boat is laying down the keel. Now that's not one piece, but it's designed in one piece with joints. So that's the first step, is to set the keel or lay down the keel. This is an 85-foot Army rescue boat. You might ask yourself, what is the Army doing rescuing anybody? You got to remember, during the war, there was no Air Force. It was the Army Air Corps. And one of Glenn's biggest customers was the Army building these 85-foot rescue boats. So here's the keel. Here's another picture of the keel, but before that, there's the Theodore Roosevelt Dock Building, where the rotor rink was. It says right there, roller skating. I see some of you are nodding your head, you've been there. And behind that was Michigan Electric. All gone now, of course. So there's the keel, again. And as soon as the keel is laid down, the next step is to put the ribs in. So here you see them building and installing the ribs. The ribs go from the keel up to the chine, which is the top part of the boat. And all of these will be covered up with planks. So we have keel, ribs, chine, and planks. This is a mock-up table where with stops they can put in and duplicate a pattern so that all of the ribs that they need to be, according to the blueprint, will be identical. There were several of these around the yard. They built them near where the keel was. Now this right here, you can see this steam escaping from this box. There's a steam box, one of them, that they actually took the wood, heated it up, brought it out, and bent it on that platform to make a rib. Each pair of ribs were different along the entire length of the platform, so stops when they were changed as you kept going forward or backward. Pretty involved process to build a wooden boat this way. There is a boat with all of the ribs attached. Keel is there, and the ribs are attached to the keel. The next, there's all boats. This is inside the big building now. That's the door that the finished boat was backed out of. So all of these boats have had the keels and the ribs installed. And the next step is to plank them. Now, I never knew this, but Robinson's built a few sailboats, and I've had this confirmed. So there's a close-up of a sailboat that Robinson's built. I did not know that. After the ribs are installed, we start planking. Planking is a pretty difficult process because you're asking a wood to move in two different directions. Curving and this way curving. As it follows the contour of the boat, it has to be bent twice. And my dad used to tell me that when you put the planking on, you use huge C-clamps. And I've got one right there on the table. You'll see, wow, that's the biggest one I've ever seen. Well, that's what they hold it until the wood dries out from the steam box. And of course, they anchor them with screws. And sometimes they'll be working and they'll hear this tremendous crack. Well, that wood decided that it didn't want to stay in that shape, and it just blows up. That happens quite often. Now, what kind of wood did they use? Common planking wood was fir, straight grain fir, which is that right there. And they also used pine in some cases. And on some of the pleasure boats, they used mahogany. Here you see the planking is completed. And I don't know if you can see these little marks right here. But every time they put a screw through a plank into the ribs, they had to cover it with wooden plugs. And I have some up here. Each boat would have thousands of these. And you made them with a special plug cutter. And then you cut them off and the plugs would come out. This is oak. Each one was sanded smooth. So you think, oh, they just got a belt sander. Belt sanders were not that common in this era. Hand sanding and planing was. There's another boat that has been planked. Now this tarp, of course, shields the guy as best they can from the elements. And we know what Michigan winters are, and they were out there building boats in the middle of Michigan winters. Another view. Here you see the ribs. This is an 85 and a 110 behind it being built. Here they are inside in various stages of construction. The boat shown right here in the front has been planked. There you see the ribs inside. Now there's a lot more. You see these ends of pieces sticking up here. These are on a diagonal for strength. So as the boat flexes, this gives the boat strength. Here's one approaching completion. This is a 56-foot long boat. It's either the Aphrodite or the Barat. I'm not sure which one. But here are more layout lofts or layout platforms for the boat prints are there. And there was usually a bandsaw right alongside the boat being built so they could cut things to the blueprint. When they built the boat, how did they transport? How did they transport a 110-foot or 85-foot or 60-foot boat? One of the common things they used was a rail car. So here's an Army boat built in the 20s, built for the U.S. Army engineers on a rail car that was lifted by a boom crane and then tied down to the cradle. Or they had a truck, there's Robinson's Marine truck. It had a trailer designed to hold that boat. That delivered wherever. I've known boats were very commonly delivered to Miami, Florida. And they weren't driven down there. Here's another view of a Robinson Seagull on a trailer. Just think of technology has changed from truck tractor pulling that big boat. It's amazing. They used big rollers to remove the boat until they got it where they wanted, either near the crane or wherever they wanted to put it. They used these big rollers, and then they had what they called a yard dozer. It was a small dozer that had a big soft push bar on the front that would push the boat where they wanted on the rollers. There's another one on a rail car. Another one ready to go. Just think of all the people that were involved, not only to build the boat, but to deal with it after it was built. There's the only picture I have of the railroad bridge from Industrial Island. You're looking upriver here. Benton Harbor's over here on the left. That's the only picture I had of the railroad right away. Of course, it's all far now. Anybody remember that railroad going across the river? Oh, yeah. Glenn displayed a lot of his boats at boat shows, just like car shows and boat shows. This is some pictures that I found of Glenn's displays at boat shows. He did a good job with that. Again, he was a consummate salesman. He knew how to sell his boats. This is a picture of the inside of one of the runabouts. Here you see Robinson Marine Construction Company. This is Art Deco. This is in the 30s, as you can tell. The interiors of Seagull boats. Many of you have not seen the inside of these boats. Again, these are black and white, but they used a lot of upholstered benches and seats and folded into beds. Again, this is Art Deco. Now, it looks like it's wet here, but that's the quality of the finish that you found on this wood. Most of it was varnish. Anybody know what that is? You got the entertainment option. That's an AM radio. You can order that as an option with your boat. Good luck getting the station, but again, some more pictures of inside of Robinson Seagull boats. Here's the helmsman station. Here's a looking down from above on the helmsman station. Here's the binnacle or compass. Here are the engine temperature and pressure and RPM gauges. These are the throttles for ignition and retard. And here are your throttles, your main, forward, and backward. This is the searchlight. There's another view of, there's another radio right here with a dial right below it. And then this is the helmsman station. This is the compass. They had this cover over it, very typical. This is another unique feature of Robinson's boat. This is an open runabout. This boat might be 39, 40, 45 feet long, but it's steered from the middle and it's open. That was one of his specialties, open runabouts. Another view of the inside. Look at the finish on that table. All applied by hand. Looks like there's something wrong with that cabinet, but that's just the gloss. Launching of the boats when they're built. This is a boom crane that they had originally at Robinson that was just about where the end of that big building was. They would have a single cable right there holding that entire boat on this cradle, letting it go down the incline of that main building. And you know what would happen if the cable broke. There it is, coming out of the main building on the incline. It's on the cradle. Then they attach slings around the boat with special cabling to keep the boat protected. And all of this you can't see, but it's attached to the hook of the crane. Now they're ready to pick the boat up. It clears the cradle, and they take the cradle away from the boat, and then they swing this boom crane from where it is over to above the river and set it back down again like that. That's how they used to launch boats at Robinson's until they put in the railway. Again, the boom was located right about there. And then they put in the marine launchway. And here it is on the marine railway. And here is the family and the pastor, the reverend of the family, ready to launch this boat. And this little platform right here is where somebody goes up and smashes the bottle of whatever against the bottom. It was a big deal. This is the building where the machinery was for the railway. There's another picture of it getting ready to go on the railway. The railway is submerged right now behind it. Here we're blessing of the boats, giving it a prayer, hopefully lasting a long time. Anybody attend one of these launchings? Go way back. Here she is, duty with the bottle of fizzy water or whatever. And here they are, ready to go down on the cable, on the launch cradle. And here's the cable attaching it to the machinery. And there it is launched. Imagine, you contracting Robinsons to build your boat, and you've seen this thing. You could go and watch it being built, and then here it is, the day of delivery to you. It's a big day in your life. This is the Aphrodite, which is two of the largest boats for pleasure that Robinson's ever built. 56 foot long and 57, and this was built in 36, according to my research. Nice. Here, if you look closely, you can see through the paint the blinking. See the seams of the blinking there, just barely visible. This is a military boat being side launched. That's how H.M. Carter launched most of their big boats. It's quite amazing. The thing just falls over and rocks back and forth. Doesn't sink. This picture is what started the whole process of me making this presentation. I posted this picture on Benton Harbor St. Joe Memories and Benton Harbor St. Joe Shipping News, and many people said, Tell me more about Robinson. Tell me more about what you're seeing here. My dad is right here. He was operating the Marine Railway. And this was all the employees at the time. This is after the war. And I say that because here are some LCTs. These were plywood, mahogany plywood landing craft that Robinson's built quite a few of. And those were some that never got finished. This gentleman right here named Zellers Campbell, he was one of the longest employees of Robinson's. He was there just before my dad, and then he retired. A very, very nice guy. I used to talk to him a lot. This guard tower was originally located at the end of the North Pier, out on the lake. I've got some pictures of that. And then it was moved here, and no one could tell me why, unless they used it maybe during the war to stand watch. I don't know. I know that watches were stood at Robinson's, H.O. Carter, and Truscott's. Yes? Okay.
What did he say?
One more time for me.
Can you repeat it so we can all
Yeah.
hear?
Your dad during the Second World War, you worked with more firearms, used the cars and legs.
Your dad did.
And your dad.
Oh, really? Didn't know that. I did not know that. He's saying my dad, during World War II, wore a sidearm, probably a 45, and stood guard at the shipyard at night. I did not know that. Now, I know a little bit about Dad's military history here in a minute, but I didn't know that. Thank you. Yes. So this picture was given to me by Shirley James Abraham. This is her dad. And her dad was superintendent. And this says Aphrodite, built in 36. And another gentleman came up to me and said that picture may have an error on it. I don't know. But I know Robinson's built the Aphrodite. I've got pictures of it in construction. Yes, sir.
You go up from that arrow, right next guy. That's my grandfather.
Your grandfather. Wow. That's great. We have roots, don't we? Yes.
I know some of the German POWs worked on some farms. Did they work at this?
Not to my knowledge. Another person has asked me that question, and yes, they did do a lot of work around here with farms, and many of them asked to stay after the war was over. But I do not know of anybody working in a military complex. He said he knew German POWs working here in the southwest Michigan area on farms as they were captured. And many of them asked to stay in the U.S. after the war was over. But to my knowledge, they did not work in the shipyard.
I got another.
Yes.
On that picture, just to let you know, my grandfather originally came from Russia. And he was in the Russian cavalry. And immigrated over to Canada and the United States and that part here.
Wow. His grandfather immigrated from Russia and obviously ended up in the St. Joe Benton Harbor area. A good friend of mine who has passed served with me on the American Legion Honor Guard in my town on the other side of the state. He was as German as you could be. He had a heavy German brogue. And his dad was in the Germany Army. And he saw which way this thing was heading. So he deserted, took his whole family, came over to the U.S. and served in the Army as an intelligence person because he had a lot of information. But it was a different era during World War II. Now, Chuck told you I'm a veteran. I'm a proud veteran, but I'm very concerned about the status of our military today. Enough said. Boats underway. Robinson's had a particular unique way that they planed or got up on keel. This boat was delivered, this is a club in Miami, and this boat was delivered down there. There's another view of it. Now this is an early boat because they usually didn't use a natural wood finish on boats in the later 30s. But this was a varnished hull. You see the squareness of the trim. Now this is an open middle cockpit. Right there is the helmsman. Now you sit inside a cabin to steer the boat. This is the commuter boat that went to Chicago back and forth in 2 hours. That's the Phantom 8. I don't know, I tried to find out what it cost to do that, but I couldn't. But they took passengers back and forth to Chicago. Mrs. Robinson loved to shop in Chicago. And she would take the Cadillac, and my dad would drive her over to Chicago to shop at Carson Curry Scott, and all the stores that aren't there anymore. And we used to go over there after Thanksgiving and watch all the animated window, all that kind of stuff. Sorry, I digress. There's that same boat underway. And again, this is another open cockpit boat called the Tuscumbia. And I don't know if there was once an area along here called Lakeside or not. I don't know. South of here, okay. This is a ink drawing, not a picture, of an early 20s boat underway. I guess that was a fairly common way of having pictures back then. Here's one alongside the yard after it's been launched. Again, this is a seagull boat. You notice how it kind of rides in the water. There's another one on an older boat. There's an open cockpit, runabout, probably 45 feet long. A lot of people on board, and it's still just chugging right along easily. There's an early style. You see the squareness of everything, and then later on they changed that to some square profiles. And here's the Barak, which is a kind of a sister ship to the Aphrodite, although they're a little different. That's 57 feet long. It's a beautiful boat. There's the tower that I talked about at the end of the North Pier. Right back here is the Coast Guard station and what have you. This is Pistornia Beach. There's another picture of it. Anybody remember that tower at the pier? Awesome. Wow.
That's where he supplied the storm warning flag.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he would know what the particular route was going to be because it's a common.
I did not know that either. Thank you. Glenn Robinson was very well acquainted with John Hacker. John Hacker was one of the best boat designers in the country. And he had his own business called Hacker Craft. Maybe some of you have heard that. But John did a lot of design of Robinson's boats. And Hacker liked to have fast boats. So he designed many of the Seagull series. Gar Wood was a guy who raced boats out of the Detroit area. He liked to go fast. So we've got a designer of fast boats and a guy that raced boats, which means now we're going to put big engines in these boats so they go fast. Robinson's Seagull boats were known to be beautiful, sturdy, and very fast. They were very much in demand before the war. They were great boats. They weren't cheap, but they were great boats. So here's some pictures I found of Seagull boats in color. There's the boat brand and step plate. This is the Algonquin. Notice the wicker furniture. I don't know what this one is. It may be the Flying Cloud, but I'm not sure. We'll talk about that one in a minute. There's a Judith R. Beautiful, beautiful boat. 54 feet. Just the styling of these boats back then, you don't see that today with fiberglass.
And the numbers they build of these pleasure boats, how many?
I'll show you mostly an answer to that in a little bit.
Okay, sorry.
But to preface your question, Robinson's by far, built more military boats and pleasure boats by a lot. There's another view of the Judith R. This one, the Isabella, is 36 feet long. It was just sold out in Detroit. I think the selling price was $58,000. Buying something almost 90 years old. So here's the back end of the Isabella. You see the blinking. There's the stern cabin, so to speak, or day cabin at the back of the boat. This is the open cockpit helm station, midway. Look at the finish on this wood. There's the step plate. This is another view of the helmsman station. This is inside, bunk room, setting room. Just beautiful. And then we have the Flying Cloud. Anybody know the history of the Flying Cloud here? I bet you remember when I tell you. This boat was built in 1928 and delivered. There's another view of it. Pretty boat. There's another view of it. This boat was delivered to Florida to this guy, Ransom E. Olds. You ever heard of him? Oldsmobile. That was the guy. He lived in Lansing, but he bought that boat and he wintered in Florida. And Mr. Robinson arranged to have it delivered to Florida. That's who this boat was built for. Now here is supposedly another view of that boat. This is Al Capone, and this is Al Capone's son driving the boat. Now suppose, and I don't believe that's true because this boat says alert, but it's a similar boat, I'll grant you that. But Al Capone ended up buying the Flying Cloud from Ransom Oldsmobile, or Ransom Olds. Now this is the inside of the Flying Cloud, and I want to point out that right there. Now you can't see it, but there's an enlargement of that medallion. And it says REO Motor Car Company, the 5th, Lansing, Michigan. Now REO, of course, stands for Ransom Eli Olds. Now he had 6 car companies. He was in business with the 5th one. He got kicked out of his first 2 companies by the finance people. They didn't like some of the things he did. So he reopened another company called REO. Maybe you've heard of the REO Speedwagon. That was a rock group, but in 1918, he actually built a truck with solid rubber tires on it called the REO Speedwagon. A little tidbit of history. This is the inside of the Flying Cloud.
In 27, he had a car model in Flying Cloud.
Really? Richard just shared with me that in 1927, Olds had a car called the Flying Cloud. That's probably why he named his boat that. Interesting, thank you. Isn't that beautiful? Now, there was a fold-down poker table, complete with pockets for your drinks. Little bottle of EO there waiting. Look at some of the workmanship on these. That's braided mahogany. What's that?
Who does that anymore?
Oh, good luck. This is what the Flying Cloud looked like in 1995. Somebody bought it, I don't know who, and they restored it to look like that again. Now, I can't imagine how much that cost. I can imagine, but I don't know for sure. It's very customary for lead carpenters and boat builders at Robinson to build their own toolbox. My dad built his. This is Bill Abrams' toolbox that Richard Ravers had in one of his presentations. And this is courtesy of Shirley's father-in-law and her husband. You see the name there. That's what some of the doors look like with tools. Now, some of those tools are actually right here. I encourage you to go up afterwards and take a look at it. Some of these just real odd, but they're all used. When you see these boats built, now they had table saws, they had band saws, they had planers, they had shapers, but they did not have the power hand tools that we have today. And most of the shaping and finishing of wood was done by hand with some of these fancy planes, shaper planes, profile planes, and so on. Also, she found Glenn Robinson's original personal binoculars at a garage sale in St. Joe. Had no idea how it got there, but she has them now. If you are interested in antique wood boats, every year in Hessel, Michigan, which is up near St. Ignace, I had spinal fusion surgery last July, and I'm still getting over it. For this year, it's going to be August 12th of 23. Anybody ever been up there to see that show? It's awesome, isn't it? I'm going to do something here that I need to get over to my computer. Excuse me, this is right. We're good. I embedded a video in my PowerPoint. Let's see if I can get it to work. This is what you see in Hessel. Steve Masabe, a little bit familiar with that boat. Keep Wahoo, 1927. Now you can go on to their website and get that full video. It's about 30 minutes long. I have not been to that show. I wanted to go, but haven't been able to go. But they tell me it's well worth it. Because Glenn Robinson was so well connected with the military, he was receiving military contracts to build boats in 1940, early 1940. Of course, we all know what happened on December 7th, 41. But after Pearl Harbor, there was a huge influx of patriotism, and thousands of men and women wanted to join up, wanted to get either drafted or join the military. Many men from Robinson's, Dachel Carter, and Truscott companies wanted to enlist in the military. Patriotism was at all-time high as compared to, never mind. The military came up with a new draft classification, and it was given to all of the men, with a few exceptions, from the three boat companies in Benton Harbor. it was said your employment is critical to the war effort. So you were exempt from being drafted, as long as you had that employment. It was very popular for, people involved in that type of manufacturing. So, the guys that got that waiver went down and joined the Coast Guard Reserve and down at the Armory. And there's my dad. And then they stood watches all over the area as part of their duty. There was a short training period, not like boot camp, but something like that. And Dad got a 214, DD 214 for his service in the Coast Guard. Military craft built by Robinsons. Again, they built many more military craft than pleasure boats because of the timing of his company. Here is a 110-foot sub-chaser. Robinsons built a lot of these boats. You say sub-chaser, where is the torpedoes? There are no torpedoes on a sub-chaser, but there are depth charges. And these guys are very fast. And there's a military boat, rescue boat getting launched from this is the side part over here. There's the bridge. This is St. Joe, this is Benton Harbor, there's the Theodore Roosevelt. Here's one coming on slips. They built a lot of military craft. There's that tower again. So here's a 110-foot sub-chaser. I told you in the first pictures that this was a fitting out dock. So here they are, close to the storeroom where they go get supplies and load up this thing with all of the stuff that it's supposed to come with after they build the basic hull and structure. They might be here 2 weeks before they get all that done. Yes?
How many boats could they put out in this short period of time?
It's a good question. He said, how many boats could you put out in that short period of time? I'll show you some stats of that in a second. This is kind of unique. This is a telegram to Glenn Robinson from the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox. Maybe you heard that name before. He said, submarine chaser number PC-540 building at your yard is badly needed for protection against German submarine. I was greatly gratified to hear that from our Navy people, that you are making unusual efforts to deliver this vessel on 30 March. May I express my thanks. Please wire as soon as vessel is delivered. That's kind of neat from the Secretary of the Navy to Glenn Robinson.
What's blacked out?
Period. It's like stop. Period. I just want to make sure you read it better. It's not redacted. So here's one, camouflage. They did some of that painting there at Robinson's also. Back here are the depth charge racks. These are anti-aircraft guns. I think they're 50s, but I'm not sure. This is a cutaway to show you just what is on that 110-foot sub-chaser. Here you see the depth charges. Here are the guns. Of course, the cabin. And then underneath, there are 3 officers and 24 enlisted men on board the 110-foot sub-chaser. Here's one being delivered downriver. Here's an 85-foot air rescue boat underway. These guys were super fast. They could do 55 miles an hour. These are target boats. You notice these flip down, these are covering portholes, and when you flip them up, all you can see out of those little slots. Well, an aircraft target boat would be used on the water. They used them in Lake Michigan, but they also used them all over the country. And if you're in that boat, you're going to flip those things up so you only can see out of those little slots. Well, here's a military target boat, and it's got steel deck plates. Bombers would practice their bomb runs using these boats as targets. And if your sandbag or dummy bomb hit anywhere in that red area, it was considered a hit. If you smacked out the cabin, no. But Robinson's built quite a few target boats. So did Rachel Carter.
Were they of less quality?
No. You'd think they were just expendable, but they weren't. I don't think people back then could build something inferior quality, because the workmanship was the thought of the day.
Yeah, maybe the material maybe would be all pine instead of mahogany.
No, they had to be probably more robust than that to stand up to that kind of stuff. And if you're thinking World War II, I don't know much about that, but I've done some research. Bombing a target from an airplane in World War II was guess at best. You were lucky. That's why they had all these carpet bombs, multiple bombs. Hope one of them would hit. Here are the aircraft target boats and some rescue boats being taken down the Mississippi. Now, my dad made many trips down the Mississippi, delivering these to New Orleans. That was a common delivery point for the Robinson boats. Now, in the early 1900s, they reversed the flow of the Chicago River from into the lake to out of the lake. And that you can go now, and you have to go through a series of canals, a couple of locks, and you'll end up on the Kankakee River, which winds around and eventually goes into Mississippi. So they took that trip all the way down and delivered those to New Orleans. The pilot was with them on the first boat. Nobody knew where, the Mississippi's got to have a pilot. So, engines used on Robinson's boats. The very first boats that Glenn built in the early 20s were Sterling engines. Sterling was a motor company out of Buffalo, New York. Now, if you look at these, they look old. 1904 to the 1930s. Here's a couple of engines, two spark plugs per cylinder, but the cylinders are individually cast. And by the way, the engine in the REO Speedwagon looks very much like that. But these are old first engines in Robinson's boats. Kermath was the next very popular engine. Now you see race boat speeds. These Husky aircraft rescue vessels are powered with 4 giant Kermath V12 Sea Raider engines. Four V12s. Here I blew that article up just a little bit to show you 51 miles an hour for an 85-foot boat. Each one is 1,500 cubic inches. Each one puts out 2,000 horsepower, or I'm sorry, 500 horsepower, 2,000 total for that boat. To me, that's impressive. Here is a V12 Kermath engine in one of the boats from the Hessel Boat Show. That one works. It has 2 ignition systems, one for each spark plug. It uses avgas, 100 plus octane. Here's a 6-cylinder Kermath engine. Robinson used a lot of those. And then Scripps was another very popular. Scripps was out of Detroit, Michigan. They built a V12. There's a picture of it on a stand. Starter, generator, reduction gear and reverse gear, carburetor 1, carburetor 2, 2 distributors and coils, and 2 spark plugs per engine. There is a down view of a Scripps V12 from a real boat. These are still very popular. Now, the question is, well, could you buy one today? They don't make them, they don't make a replica, but there are some for sale. I saw one recently, I'll show you in a minute. They're 894 cubic inches each. 894 cubic inches. Ford has a car with a 1-liter engine, which is about 62 cubic inches. That one was for sale for $27,500, just the engine. So they are rare and they are expensive. They also made an inline Scripps engine, Marine. Now Scripps merged with Booth to become the Scripps Booth Car Company in Detroit. And they built cars from 15 to 23. They didn't last very long. Anybody seen a Scripps Booth car? Here is a boat from Garwood. This is the one that he raced that had a Scripps V12 in it. Hall Scott was a very popular boat engine manufacturer. They also powered up planes, trains, buses, and boats. V12, 575 horsepower. This is 20s and 30s technology. Many Greyhound and Trailways buses use Hall Scott engines. Overhead valves, hemispherical combustion chamber for the men. Was in business from 1910 to 1960. Here is a 6-cylinder Hall Scott Invader gasoline engine. This is what the engine room of a Robinson's boat would look like. There's a V12. There's one on the left, you can't see. Here are 2 inline 6-cylinders in an engine room. And here's their V12, 2,000 cubic inches, 575 to 700 horsepower. These are huge engines. Again, 100 plus avgas. And of course, Packard was used in a few of Robinson's boats. And you've seen the movie PT 109. The PT boats all had Packard engines in them. This is what it looks like. That's another view with it on a stand. Just a beast of an engine. PT boats had 3 of these. They were about 75 to 85 foot long. Each of them put up to 1,850 horsepower times 3 for a PT boat. That's why they move so fast. Here's a PT boat just to show you that the 3 Packard engines were right in here. Now the motor machinist mates that were assigned to PT boats, a high percentage of them ended out of the war deaf or extremely hard of hearing. And they did that because 3 of those screaming away inside that engine room, the noise was deafening. And we didn't know about earplugs or earmuffs or ear protection back then. It was just, well, that was my duty. Here's a race boat that I just took a picture of. There's 4 Packard V12 in one boat. I have no idea how fast that thing moves, but I bet it's pretty fast. Robinson Seagull boats were of course known to be fast compared to many others. During the war, Robinson and the whole crew was given the E Award. One of the few companies that was awarded this E Award was presented by the Army and the Navy. E stands for Excellence in Production. And here's the criteria that they measured to award those, that's that standard. How well the company did business and how they deal with problems. So here's everyone at the ceremony in front of the big building. There's the boom crane. And again, it was put on by the Army and the Navy. And each person was given a metal E-pin, every employee. And Dad had a couple extras, so I have one, and I gave one to Miss McCausland. a nice keepsake. Besides the ceremony, a banquet was held for all, and I had a menu for that banquet. Fancy, but I don't know what I did with it. Couldn't bring it. And then you're given the pennant to fly on your place of business, the E-pennant, which is like, look at us, we have been awarded this great honor. Here's Mr. Robinson receiving the E-pennant from Admiral of the Navy. I don't know who these gentlemen are. I hope somebody can tell me, but this is one of the Navy guys. He's a captain, putting the E-pennant on the workers. Here are some more superintendents and supervisory people. Here's the pen. Here's Glenn. I don't know who the lady is. I haven't been able to find out. That's Mr. Robinson. This says Charles Spring something. I don't know who that is. Here's Glenn at the banquet with the speaker. Now, you asked me how many military boats and how many pleasure boats they built. This information was obtained by me online with an extensive search. However, from what I know is true, not all of it is 100% accurate. So bear that in mind. It's hard for you to see, but here is the first boat built in 1925. It was a fishing vessel called the Cassandra. It was 43 foot long and gross tonnage of 19 tons. So from 25, 27, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 35, 36, 35, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39. All of a sudden down here, so from here to here were all pleasure boats. I know some of them are missing from that list. 25 to 41. The largest one ever built was the Barat, 57 feet long. The largest pleasure boat that is. Now, notice in 1940, before even the war started for us, he started building boats for the Coast Guard, the Army. These are all Army boats. Most of them are 40 foot long in that era. Then he started building 50 footers, then 110 footers, and then back to 40s. Now we're from 41 to 43. Here we are from 43 up to 45. These are all military boats, some passenger boats, some tugboats. There's the Army rescue boats, 85 footers. And then pretty much at the end of 45, they stopped with most of the military construction and shifted back to pleasure. They built a lot of tugs too. Here's one right here I'll point out shortly.
How many is that?
You know, I didn't count them because I know it isn't 100% accurate, but by far, like 3 to 1 military to pleasure, easily. This is available online, or I can send it to you. I didn't count them myself. The last pleasure boat, to my thinking, was built, that 60 is not true, because that yard was not in operation in 1960. 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, and even some in 59, there was some work being done. Not much. I'll tell you why in a minute. Here is a one tug, 42 feet long, built in 45, and it's called the Romeco, which stands for Robinson Marine Construction Company. Glenn wanted to build this tug for use around the shipyard that he had, pushing, tugging, towing, whatever. So let's talk a little bit about the Romeco. I'm sorry for the quality of the picture, but I had to take it from a newspaper because that's the only thing I could find. I played on this boat as a kid many hours. I was the captain, I was the crew. I mean, I had fun on that boat. It was on a cradle, sitting in the yard. This is that big building we talked about. And it's also on the railway. This is the railway right here. There's the rails. So the last work my dad did was rebuild a little bit of the stern transom right here. It had some dry rot in it. So he rebuilt all that with some help. And here is the Marine launchway ready to receive the Romeco. So they use that yard caterpillar and they put it back over in place on the cradle. Just before launching of the Romeco, the girl in this picture is Lynn Robinson's granddaughter, Ann Inslee, who is now Mrs. Ann McCausland. Right there. There she is. This is 1958, October 20th. This is a copy of the newspaper article. Two pretty little girls were commissioned to launch the seagoing tug Saturday afternoon at Robinson Marina. Standing on the left with the champagne bottle is Ann Inslee, granddaughter of Glenn Robinson, founder of the marina, and on the right is the bottle is Shelley Greer, the daughter of Irwin Greer, who was the founder of Greer Shop Training, who bought the Romeco from Robinson, and he had a training school on maritime repairs. Ann, do you remember that?
I do.
Do you really?
Yeah, I do remember because we actually, my parents, we had taken it out a couple.
Okay.
Yeah, and dealt with people.
Ann's parents were Eleanor and Richard Inslee. Richard was a very well-known attorney here. I knew both of them very well. This is the Romeco now with a real picture after she was launched. There's the Harv military training, the U.S. Navy Reserve training ship was right there. So here are the people that I know and some that I don't know. This gentleman is Mr. Greer. He's the guy that bought the tugboat. He owns the Greer Marine Training. This is Zellers Campbell, who I told you about earlier, a long-time employee of Robinson. There's my dad. This gentleman is Hank Beelman, who was also the last employees. He was gone, I think, 2 years before my dad was. And this is Rush Cowerduck. It's not Russ, it's Rush. Anybody know him? We'll tell you about him in a little bit. The rest of these folks, I do not know. I think this gentleman worked with Mr. Greer, but I do not know these folks. Now, the interesting story about this is, right after they verified that the craft was seaworthy, Mr. Greer, my dad, and myself delivered this boat to Chicago. And that was a highlight of my early teenage years. It was awesome. We crossed the lake in that boat. We delivered it to the Chicago Yacht Club, which is kind of near the Museum of Science and Industry. Robinson also had floats in the Blossom Parade, which I did not know. I don't know what year that is, but it's at least in the 30s. Now, business is over. They're no longer building boats. What happened to Robinsons? In 1955, a company out of California rented, they didn't buy, they rented that large building that we saw, Robinson Marine Construction Company, on the sign. That was a Wizard Boat Company. And they took over that big building and they built two things. They built fiberglass boats and swimming pools. I can vividly remember walking into that building while they were building those boats, and the smell of those chemicals was just overwhelming. nobody had masks on, nobody had respirators on. It wasn't done that way in 55. This is an article taken from the newspaper. I know you can't read it, but I will tell you that building boats with fiberglass was relatively a new thing in 1955. And that's one of the death knells of the wooden boat building business. By the way, of all of the boat builders that we've talked about, Hackercraft is still in business. They still build wood boats, but get out 4 checkbooks if you want to buy one. This is one of the product labels off of the boat. Laminated fiberglass. This is what it looked like. This is one of their runabouts. The largest one they built, I think, was 18 feet. They didn't last long. My dad was interested in them, and he bought stock in the Wizard Boat Company, and here's the stock certificate on this table with my dad's name on it. And it's worth absolutely nothing. Then, the cement plant that was built, which I call the Huron Cement Plant, now it's another name, there was a marina where that cement plant is now. That marina was called St. Joe Sportsman's Port. The service manager was Rush Coverduck. I love the way things were written back then. Rush Coverduck, speedboat racer and former man about boats at Sportsman's Port for 6 years, has teamed with retired boat builder Glenn Robinson to absorb the bulk of the dispossessed craft in a brand new marina next to the Wizard Boat Works. So Rush Coverduck went in with Glenn and rented some of the property that Glenn had and that little niche where the layout dock was, and they built 56 slips for a marina. So again, the cement plant is what displaced the previous marina. Anybody remember that marina? I do not.
Whirlpool had a little dock there after it was gone,
Okay?
under where the water tower was.
Yes.
Which is gone now too.
So here's what it looked like. This is the fitting out dock. This is the supply room. There's Robinson's offices. This bay is where you saw all those military boats. So here's these 56 slips that Rush put in. He had this storage building also for winter storage. And storage was $10 a month. Now, I knew Rush, and we got along pretty well. I was still a kid, but I helped him out with some of the things around there. He fixed boats also. Wizard was this big building behind, Wizard was the big building behind the layout room or supply room. The end of Robinson Marine Construction. Buildings are now being torn down. 1970. Why? New bridge. A new bridge was going to be built to replace the old one, which probably was needing replacement. New bridge in 74. This is from the Herald Palladium. 5 Twin City landmarks will fall this year. What are they? The Lobster Lounge in St. Joe Fishery. Anybody remember that? I ate there once, I think. Okay. What else? Thumb on the right button here. Schultz Roofing. All they did was move. They didn't go out of business, they moved. The Anchor Inn, which is my Jungle Inn, that did them in. And of course, Anchor's Away in Marina. So they were all displaced in favor of the new bridge. So here's the big building that all of the action was taking place in, including the layout loft. Here it is being torn down. Here's the pile of rubble afterwards. Kind of breaks my heart to see that. The marina was always well placed by then. They just tore the buildings down. Glenn passes away on April 23rd, 1957. He was 62 years old. Yes? You remember the smell? Gentleman said he worked for Wizard before they moved out, and he remembers the smell. Well, my commission is now over. That's right. Very good. What I did was take the obituary from the paper, and again, it's written in the era language back then. And I want just to read it to you. I think it's important that you know. Glenn Robinson, native son of Benton Harbor, who built an international reputation with his Twin Cities shipbuilding company, died early yesterday afternoon at Memorial Hospital. Death came to the 62-year-old industrialist after he'd been confined to the hospital bed for the past month with a heart attack. Shipbuilder Robinson was on the comeback trail last week, but a new attack rapidly took his life. Robinson was the son of a lake captain and Mrs. John Lee Robinson. His dad was a lake captain that moved some of those ships around on the lakes, who were pioneer settlers of the area. His late father was a Great Lakes ship captain, president of the Farmers and Merchant Bank, school board member, and businessman. Robinson is survived by his wife, the former Marie O'Brien. He also leaves his daughter, Eleanor Robinson Inslee, and two grandchildren, Glenn and Ann Inslee, and a sister, Mrs. Worth Bean. Robinson's body was taken to the Kurlikowski Funeral Home in St. Joe. Services will be held on Friday at 10:30 a.m. at St. Joe Catholic Church. Mr. Robinson's death brought the curtain down on a man who in early life began displaying the talents he had inherited from his well-known parents. Robinson received his elementary education in the Benton Harbor school system. He later graduated from the Culver Military Academy in Culver, Indiana, and then attended Notre Dame and the University of Michigan to study engineering. Robinson attended the Naval Aeronautical Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and graduated as one of the first naval aviators. During World War I, he served with the budding Navy Air Corps. In the Second World War, the Navy presented Robinson with the coveted E Award for his excellence in turning out small craft for the fight against the Axis and Japan. By World War II, Robinson's reputation as a boat builder had soared through the Robinson Marine Company, which he founded. He built pleasure craft. Some went to foreign powers and were believed to have been converted for coastal naval use. Robinson's own line was known as the Seagull Fleet, a group of powerful, staunch, and fast pleasure boats that were leaders in their class. The pleasure boats built were trim and sturdy like Robinson's patrol, rescue, and anti-submarine warfare craft the industrialists later set down the ways for the Navy. Robinson Marine was one of the first shipyards in the nation to win the naval construction orders prior to Pearl Harbor. I got this from Ann McCausland's family. This is a picture of his orders sending him for duty in World War I in Great Britain, France, and Italy, and there's a copy of his passport. It's dated 28 September 1918. Glenn was 23 years old. This presentation was designed by me, exactly what it says, in memoriam of Glenn Robinson, who was a very successful and powerful man. He was one of those bringing up from the bootstraps guy that many of us know. But I hope you learned a little bit more about Glenn Robinson and his business, and probably just think good when you think of him, because he was a very good man. I'd like to thank Miss Ann McCausland, Clay McCausland, her son, for giving me some documents, Mr. Richard Ravers, Christine Potch, who's the 8th Away Marina, Karen Driscoll sent me some pictures, Chuck Jager, of course, from the Morton House, Michael Moran, the harbor master from Benton Harbor, St. Joe, and Shirley Jane Davis for all the work, all the help that they gave me on this presentation. And with that, we're done. Thank you. Thank you. I really wanted to do a good job with this and get you to understand more about Robinsons. There's no hurry to leave, but I would encourage you to come up and take a look at these tools. And if I can answer your questions about anything, I'd be happy to. Thanks again.
Krieger? You know, other people have asked me that. I don't know. My family
Big boy. Say what?
You got a 4-inch hole saw? I think I
Yeah,
do.
probably
You do? I think
in
I
that
do.
area.
I think I do, but I'm not sure. Well done. In the event I can't find mine, I might pop down.
Good job.
What do you think?
Excellent. Very good.
Appreciate that.
That was excellent. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for coming. I
appreciate
hope I
it.
didn't bore you to death. You think you've got that on Facebook?
An hour and 42 minutes. I'm just shutting it down now.